to Faith Meets Fate, where we explore connection and meaning through the stars. Welcome back to Faith Meets Fate. I am Mindy DeGraffenreid. I'm here with Ryan Hunt and Bianca Celine, and we are excited to do a little bit of a follow-up on the last podcast that we put up. So today we'll be talking about Joseph Smith's birth story, but also some different ideas about the horary. So we've spent some time pondering, discussing, and there are definitely some different ways that we could read the chart. There's some ideas from historical figures, and this is an interpretation act, right? So we come to it with the things that we know and understand, and we bring our own image to it, don't you think? And so it's a task to kind of unwind it. And so I think it's going to be exciting to hear some of the different possibilities. So Ryan, share with us what you did afterwards, because it looks like you kind of went into a deep dive researching.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So I guess to summarize, I mean, because our last video was, over an hour, and but at the end of the result of it was, so the question was Joseph Smith a fraud, right? And we got to where we thought that there was some, delusion, illusion, kind of, self defraudment or something going on. Maybe not necessarily a conscious fraud. I mean, that's kind of like the result that we got to in a nutshell, right, over that time. And we did it through some creative use of the horary. And to be honest, in a lot of horary, we don't use the outer planets, and we did use the outer planets. So I don't want to try to pretend to the traditional horarists out there that our use of outer planets was in any way canonical. But as I was kind of talking to some other horary astrologers online, and then doing some more research into Albateni and Bonatti and Lilly's different significations, it didn't overthrow what we'd talked about, but I think that there was some refinement that I think is good to talk about. And part of the refinement was, in my mind, because the question that was posed was Joseph Smith a fraud? And then John Dehlin had these 5 different points about, as examples of what could be considered or construed to be fraudulent activities. And they were all spread across the broad spectrum of Joseph's life. And, got me to thinking that if you ask the question, was Joseph Smith a fraud? Obviously, when he came out of his mother's womb, he wasn't a fraud.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So if there is any fraudulence that's taking place by the time he dies, at what point does that happen? Right? How do we see that?
The question is too broad. Is that what you're saying?
It's not that it's too broad. It's that, it's like the question itself could have pointed to a specific time, but the 5 examples from John Dehlin spread across a broad spectrum of time. Mm-hmm. So that got me to thinking, actually, Bonatti has a technique for doing multiple option consideration. And I use this in horary for polyamorous relationship questions, because you're dealing with polyamorous people who have multiple partners. And so it's sometimes the questions are to differentiate between one partner and another and things like that. So then we need to have a multiple consideration. So there's different ways of doing that. Bonatti's is just one of them. But he uses, if I remember right, he uses the triplicity rulers, which then got me to thinking about the use of triplicity rulers as measurements or application to a person's different stages of life. So dividing the person's life into 3 phases, and then using the first triplicity lord as the first portion of life, the second triplicity lord is the second portion, and the participating triplicity lord as the last portion of life. And so that kind of got me thinking, what we could actually do is, instead of a universal signifier for Joseph Smith, we could go to the triplicity lords and look at how the triplicity lords are behaving in the horary, right? So, and look at the different stages of life. So, was Joseph Smith a fraud in the first phase of life? He was 39 when he died, so we could evenly divide that into 13 years each, right? Roughly. So we just kind of like, is the first period of his life fraud? Second period of life, fraud. Third period life. So we can look for those significations and then bring in that a little bit. So I thought that would be kind of fun to just like really quickly look at, if you want to explore that together and just kind of look at the triplicity.
Yeah, but maybe before we dive into it, I want to kind of zoom out again.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was pondering on was, like you said, we were using some of the outer planets, and we are not denying the fact that we were doing some, divinatory, not following the rules of the book, right? We were feeling into that. That's fine. But I'm curious, in true technique form.
Yeah.
We kind of ended with, at least I'll say this was where my mind ended, was, okay, Mercury had not perfected. Gosh, you'd have to have seen it, the last episode, for this to make sense, right?
Yeah.
So we had Mars being Joseph Smith in the chart.
Yeah.
And Mercury had not perfected in that application. But I'm wondering if we were to simplify it even further and say, okay, are we even looking at an action? Because we were not discussing specific lies or scams or anything that was being done, right? There was not an action. We were talking about the character of a person.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if we could simplify it down even further and just find that signature, right? Like, do we look at the signifier of Joseph Smith as that Mars in Aries conjunct Saturn in his fall, as the symbol of a person rather than actions? And I may be totally off base here. That's just, I wonder about that, where we're looking at two malefics, where we're looking at that Mars in Aries is really powerful. It's, in its own power, and it's conjunct Saturn, a malefic that's in its fall, so could we stop right there?
I mean, I think that we wouldn't. So we have to decide which one we're going to use for the signifier, Mars or Saturn, right? So if it's L7, it would be Saturn. And if it's L9, it's Mars. And Bianca, you had suggested using L7. I was leaning on L9. And my reasoning for L9 over L7 is this. If you ask a horary question about the king or the queen, you don't use L7, you use L10. And Joseph Smith was kind of like that. He's a universal character for the people, the Mormon people, right? He's like, and in fact, he goes by prophet, priest, and king is how he's anointed himself. Right. He was running for president of the United States. He is a figure that is like that. He is holding a kind of a universal role, right? So that's why I mean, you just wouldn't, if you were the only reason you would use L7 if you were asking a question about the king is if you were the queen asking a question about your husband, right? Like if I was asking a question about Trump or, the King of England or something, I would not use L7, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the reason why but there were a lot of people online that were saying, oh no, you need to use L7 because they're a named person. But I do think that, and I think you could use L7. Like, I think, and especially in this
reading,
they're so close together. Mars and Saturn are so close together.
They're at the same degree.
Yeah. But my understanding and the way that I use the signifiers is if we're going to use Mars as the signifier, we don't consider Mars's malefic nature. Mars is not self-inflicting maleficness on itself. Even a benefic planet or a malefic planet, we don't utilize the malefic nature or the benefic nature of the planet itself in the signifier. We use that for the planets that it's making contact with, is whether it's being bona fide or maltreated.
Now,
that's how I would use it.
Is that in alignment with what the ancient writings said, though? That was something that
my understanding of it is that way. My understanding. So, I mean, obviously, we just have to read the writings and figure it out for ourselves. But my understanding is that if Mars is the signifier, we would utilize Saturn's malefic nature as Mars coming into contact with it, which is Mars applying to Saturn.
Okay.
So Mars is then applying to a malefic. If Saturn is the signifier, well, Saturn is slower, so Mars is still applying.
Mm-hmm.
But in that sense, the signifier is receiving the application of the malefic as opposed to applying to the malefic.
Right.
So they're just kind of like, they're very subtle ways in which, and they're so close together. So it's just a subtle way in which we would look at the reading a little bit,
okay.
But basically they are L7 and L9 are almost in a conjunction. They're in a partile configuration with each other right now. Yeah. In the chart. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess you're right. I wish I had the text in front of me, but I felt like that was part of what got me thinking, was that we, in modern times, we don't like to moralize anything. And yet in, ancient times, it is the malefic, right? And so inherently it is considered a more difficult planet.
Well, yeah. So, and this also comes down to the way that individual people practice. So when I practice in my practice, the way that I read, this, now we're stepping outside of horary specifically, but in general, the way that I read malefic and benefic conditions of the planets is in terms of determining the dignity of the planets.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we determine the dignity of the planets, that helps us to understand the natal promise.
Mm-hmm.
That would also apply for transiting planets, understanding the dignity of the transiting planet. But I don't view it as a personal assault on me or whoever I'm giving a reading to. Like I wouldn't say like Saturn is maltreating the native of the chart. Saturn's not maltreating me. If it's my birth chart, Saturn's not maltreating me. Saturn may maltreat another planet in the chart, reducing its overall dignity, so that it has a lower capacity to perform. And Jupiter may be bonifying, or Venus may be bonifying in order to increase that planet's capacity to perform. But then once we've rated the planetary dignity, and I'm just taking this from Demetra George's texts, which my keyboard is resting on. Assessing the dignity of the planets first, right? So that's kind of more how I use the malefic or benefic nature of planets. Is they're bonifying or maltreating each other. The planets are doing that to each other, not to the individuals of the chart, right? So I don't know if that kind of talks about what you were thinking.
Yeah, I think I'm just, in narrowing back into the horary, the specific question, if we were reading it from William Lilly's eyes or something, would it have been treated as positively as we did? And I would even argue, and this is again for myself, looking at the luminaries in the ninth, both exalted, one of the things that I feel for myself is, did we come to it as the querent in a place of thinking that we know? Have we exalted our own understanding and we come biased? Or even on the flip side, not wanting to come across like we're anti And so we're tiptoeing, so it could go either way.
Mm.
Are we walking on eggshells? Are we trying to, sound
Yeah,
like
I mean, I don't think I did. I don't know about either of you, but I don't think I did. I honestly, I think one of the mistakes that I made, and I don't even know if it's a mistake, but one of the things that I was saying, last time we met about Saturn was treating Saturn as a planet of dignity, right? Having, Saturn has a lot of inherent integrity as a
right?
planet, right? And so I think that was one of the things that I was bringing into the reading, which is more of a condition that you might read into a natal chart, and I think it was probably misplaced in the horary.
Mhm.
But aside from that, I think a lot of this, I don't think we were particularly flattering towards Joseph Smith.
Well, here's the thing as well, is that with exaltations in Horary, the way I think about it is, and even maybe in natal charts, is that where is there inflation, not just on the positive side, but also inflation in our own belief, in our own biases. So whether that's, I believe Joseph Smith is a fraud because I know all these things about him and the way things have succeeded. So I am exalting myself in that opinion of him, or whether I think that there's some positive things and that, Joseph Smith is innocent and all these things, like, you know what I mean? So it's either like, I just think like it's an inflation of our own biases that may have gotten in the way of our judgments of the chart, possibly just keeping it
as a
open.
possibility.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
like,
I don't know. I mean, I don't think our judgment was off. Like, I mean, do you think our judgment was off, or?
No, I feel like it could have gone different, though. I feel
In what
like,
way?
I think that I liked
As
our
a stronger
judgment.
signifier of fraud or a stronger signifier against fraud? Like which?
Well, at least based on the text, specifically, Ryan, you
Uh-huh.
created
Yeah.
some text and shared with us
Uh-huh.
offline, right?
Yeah.
It seemed to really point to, don't even look at all the other things. We're just looking strictly Mars in Aries
Yeah.
is this big,
Okay.
bold, powerful,
Yeah.
and so if we went with that alone, it seemed to me that the writing that you shared with me pointed to, yeah, he's a fraud. Like,
Yeah.
just simplify the whole thing.
Mhm.
And also, and just briefly as well, when I was reading through what you had shared, Ryan, as well, just a little thing was more so on Lily's judgment, if we were to
Mhm.
go by his how his principles in Horary, was just about the dignities of the planets. So we've got a Mars in its own domicile, and the strongest of the planets that we're talking about, Saturn, Mars, and
Mhm.
Mercury. And I like the way he talked about Mercury being peregrine. So he's like a wanderer with no opinions of his own or no agenda of his own,
Yeah.
other than, so he's kind of like being like influenced in, I'm not making sense here, but like just the way that Lily kind of described it in terms of how ultimately Joseph Smith knew exactly what he's doing, and that he had his agenda and therefore is fraudulent in a way. So
And that the
yeah.
other characters that you're referring to are within his control, right? Because he's domiciled Mars and Aries, Saturn's fall, Mercury's peregrine. It's like
And
they're all
the negative significations that Alberuni and Bonatti are talking about are not they have a deeper roots than the modern legal understanding of fraud, right? So they're
right.
looking at deception, poor condition. They're looking at thievery. It's looking at it from a very valid way of looking at it, but also like, at least when I thought of the word fraud, and John put in his article, here's the definition of fraud, here's my 5 examples. So I was thinking about it from a very structured perspective myself. I do think that the planets are very I think we came to a clear spot that there is a very strong impact of fraud on the situation. Well, I think where we ended up was, is the fraud like deliberate and conscious, or was he himself defrauding himself? So that was like kind of like the question. And then so that's kind of like where we left it, right?
Right.
And then, so then kind of circling back, so we kind of stepped away a little bit. Maybe we go back in at this, thinking about the 3 stages of life.
Right.
So I don't know if you feel like up to looking at the triplicity lords and looking at it, or what?
Before we go into the triplicity lords, we are going to establish, because my mind automatically went to, because I've done Bonatti's delineating a chart based on triplicity lords in the different phases of life, and I've done it from like the sect chart ruler, and sect like day-night chart, and I've done it that way. So how are we going to do this? Are we going to do it from using the triplicity lord of Mars or like how are we going to do it?
I would use the triplicity. I would say let's use the triplicity rulers of the sign of the signifier. So if we're going to use, well, they're both Saturn and Mars. So it would, they're both in Aries. So I would say, use the triplicity lords of Aries.
Okay.
In Descartes,
as opposed to the second, instead of the triplicity lords of the second.
We've got the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn as triplicity rulers of a day fire chart.
And so my logic around that, and this is just what I'm saying, you guys can argue differently if you want. My logic around that is if you're using it for a native and their natal chart, using the triplicity rulers of the sect-light, that is because you're connecting the sect-light with the native, and in the horary we were connecting Mars with the quested. So that's why I'm, or Saturn. That's why I'm saying the triplicity rulers of the signifier as opposed to the sect-light.
Yeah, true. Question: if we had have used the 7th house ruler, but it's in Mars, so therefore it's still going to be fire.
They're all in Aries. So
they're all in Aries.
Aries with a day chart.
The difference between L7 and L9 is simply the reading on whether a malefic planet is applying to the signifier, or whether the signifier is malefic and being applied to, or however. I just kind of mixed myself up there. But, it's really simply in that last few arc minutes of application to the final perfection that we're dealing with, which I think is interesting from the standpoint of, like just the way that Joseph died at the end of his life, the violent death that he suffered. Right. So I think that that's an interesting, to me, that almost feels like as the planets are so close together that they're almost perfecting a full-on fraud, but they're not quite there or something like that, But I do think that, I'm interested to explore this. I didn't really do a lot of like delineation offline with it. I just kind of wanted to talk in real time with you guys about this triplicity idea, because I do think that it's important to, like, John's laid out the 5 points. They were across his life. A person obviously changes their character over time. And and full disclosure here. So I have been doing a lot of like historical research or reconnecting with the historical narratives, going to Bushman and Michael Quinn and, reading all this, doing all the stuff, and going back, which I've done many times, all the way back to when I was in college in the early 90s. I just think that I think it's interesting to look at the evolution of the person's life, and that we can't quite put, this is such a complex life. Joseph Smith is such a complex person. It's very difficult to like categorically, say in one thing in terms of one aspect of life. It's a very umbrella kind of statement, but it's fun. I think it's a fun, it's caused us a lot of like, discussion. So it's been a fun question. Yeah.
Ryan, do you have the 5 questions right handy, or statements? What was it?
I think so. Let me pull them up here. I had them in
Or Bianca, do you have them? You just raised your hand.
I just frustrated.
Let's see. No, I can pull them up here really quick. Let's see. It's on Substack, and it is on John Dehlin. Understanding Mormonism is his Substack. And the article is Was Joseph Smith a Fraud? Published on April 13th. The 5 areas are evidence in favor of Joseph Smith being labeled a fraud. Number 1, treasure finder with a magic stone in a hat. Number 2, the golden plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the lost 116 pages. Number 3, seer or divine translator of ancient languages. Number 4, the Kirtland bank scandal. And number 5, polygamy denials. Those are the umbrella categories. Do you want me to read through a little bit on each bullet or summarize them, or?
I know them. I'm comfortable with what those mean. Bianca, how do you feel?
I mean, do the idea for our audience. I mean, the article's on Substack, and I think we linked it in the last description, or if we didn't, we can. It's John Dehlin's Substack, Understanding Mormonism, and the article was April 13th, Top 5 Reasons People Call Joseph Smith a Fraud. So I would encourage people just to go look at that and read the article. But yeah, the treasure finder with a magic stone in a hat is about divination and whether he could do divination, whether he couldn't, and whether if he couldn't, was he, asserting that he could, that kind of stuff. And then the golden plates, Urim and Thummim, is just around. I don't know if people don't know, Joseph Smith talked about the golden, having these golden plates that were given to him by an angel and using those to get the Book of Mormon. And then the seer or divine translator of ancient languages. Joseph Smith considered himself a translator and using the stones and the Urim and Thummim to be able to translate ancient languages. So we can talk. And I studied all this stuff in Dr. Chase's class in my church history. It's fascinating, and I was fine with all of it. And I've gone back and been re-upping this, and I'm actually, and you both know this about me. I have all these problems where I keep starting all these books that I keep writing. So I'm now writing a book about this.
Oh boy.
Surprise. They never get published, but I keep writing them anyways. But yeah, and then the Kirtland bank scandal was just talking about Joseph Smith forming a bank and how the bank collapsed and all the circumstances around that. And then the polygamy denials, where Joseph was taking plural wives and denying that it was happening. Right. So yeah.
Okay. So those were all the evidences that John Dehlin gives that yes, in fact, Joseph Smith was a fraud. Like that simple.
These are his evidence in favor. Yeah. So the definition that John posts is fraud, a noun, a person who is not who they pretend to be, an imposter. For example, he claimed to be a licensed psychologist, but he turned out to be a fraud. Also one who defrauds or a cheat. So that was John's definition of fraud. And those were the 5 examples that he gave in favor of declaring Joseph a fraud. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by, and again, maybe we're doing this in reverse order, but coming to the table with the question where this evidence is presented.
Yeah.
It's almost like, well, there it is. Like, the Horary, giving another witness or contradicting those those right?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think that those are valid things to bring up, and they all have ways of being. So let's setting the Horary aside for a second. We can just talk about them, in themselves first for a second. So let me pull it back up here. So the first one, the treasure finder with a magic stone in a hat. I don't think that that's a simple. I don't think that's a simple thing to say that just because he was unsuccessful, that he was a fraud. You know, that's like,
Right.
you know, and I'm just being, you know, we have to be a little bit honest here as the three of
Right.
us. We are astrologers who look at the stars to get answers about stuff. Right? And we're casting a horary, which is a divinatory practice to, you know, ask. And one of the bullet points is, here's a guy who was claiming he could do divination.
Right. We're just in bed with him doing the same stuff.
I don't feel I'm a fraud. I don't think either of you two are frauds just because we're practicing divination. So I don't think that practicing divination by itself is evidence of being a fraud. And the thing about it is, at that point in time in history, if you go back and look at the historical record of the world and society, it was a very robust spiritual, occult, you know, there was a lot, people were doing a lot of divination. It was very normal to do divination and to be a diviner at that point in time. And a lot of people did these things, both for professionally and for fun. People would they would go on treasure hunts for fun. There was no television. There were no movies, right? There weren't even a lot of like novels, you know, it's not like you could just like go read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy or, you know, The Lord of the Rings or something. Like there wasn't really, there was the Bible and there was doing fun and weird shit like going treasure hunting, right? So this was kind of what people did for entertainment. And they did it seriously, but it was all, you know, everybody was kind of doing it. So I'm just saying, like,
which opens the door for the potential for fraud, right? Because it would be an easy thing to step in and say, this is a common practice. So I can go out and say, I'm going to go find you a treasure deliberately.
If you felt you couldn't do it.
Okay.
But do you feel like you can't do astrology? Why would we think that Joseph Smith would not think he could do this?
Well, and I'm fully making an assumption, right? Like this is absolutely not truth. Because we don't know.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm just saying the fact that it was common doesn't necessarily mean that there's any more likelihood that the people that were doing it had any malicious intent. Like,
sure,
like,
absolutely.
Like I think it's entirely possible, given the narrative of Joseph Smith's life, and this has nothing to do with the Horary, which we'll get into, but I think it's entirely possible that he actually thought he could do this.
Yes, I agree with you. And it's possible
that he
could use it to try to gain. That's possible as well. So
absolutely. He was charging money for it. Yeah, no, he was totally using it to gain. He was using it as a business venture. So he was definitely making money off of it. And I don't know whether he believed he could do it or whether he knew that he couldn't. And he was like, just, you know, shilling people or not. But I think within the context of the historical factors, it's reasonable to think that he probably thought that he could do this. And he probably did it. I mean, he didn't just like do it forever. Like he did it and eventually he stopped because I think he probably realized he sucked, you know. You know, but I do
then strike this from John's list.
What's that?
Because would you strike this as one of the evidences because we cannot know his intent?
No, I wouldn't strike it as one of the evidences. I think it could be evidence for. I don't think it necessarily has to be evidence for. And so therefore it's a good candidate for our own divination to help us determine which one is true.
Okay. Fight fire with fire.
Yeah. I think he easily could have been, you know, conning people with this. and he easily could have been completely authentic and sincere. But what all I'm saying is that we have this tendency as modern scientifically minded people to think that divination is bull. But like, I kind of know people, like when I was a kid, I studied, water witching and dowsing. And I used to go out with my rods and try to do water witching, and other people like, this was like, even like in the 80s, 70s and
I have
80s.
dowsing rods. What are you talking about?
Right. Like it was totally like, like, so people like, this is not something that's like, oh, I can use my dowsing rods, therefore, I'm like people, like it's a thing that people do, and they're like, people could actually water witch and go find water, and people were successful doing it.
Absolutely.
So I think Joseph had the opportunity. I mean, I think that there's a possibility that he was authentic and just a failure, which is different from being a fraud. I don't know which one. The horary can tell us, but that's that one. So anyways, so that was the treasure finders. And then the second one was golden plates, Urim and Thummim, and the lost 616 pages. I'm just going to briefly say about the golden plates. And I don't know, and I don't have like the citations for this, but I remember when I was taking church history, that at BYU Hawaii, what my professor was teaching us about the golden plates, and a lot of the things around the golden plates and the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, all these things that were going on, was Joseph. By this point in time, Joseph was old enough to have been, so the background is everybody in that part of the world was, at least the men and many of the women, were Masons. Mm-hmm. They were practicing Freemasonry. Specifically, from what I remember, is that Joseph Smith and his, father and, relatives and the people he's associated with were part of the York Rite in Freemasonry, which is different from the Scottish Rite, which is a little bit more. I don't need to go into the details of that, because I'm myself not a Mason, and if I was, then I wouldn't be able to go into the details anyway. So, but it's a very fascinating subject to study, and I, here I am at BYU learning about the different, sects of Freemasonry, and within the York Rite style of Freemasonry, there was apparently the idea of access to divine symbols and being able to discuss with other Freemasons the use of symbolic language to talk about things that were happening in a person's visionary experience. Those were a part of the language that was going on. And like the golden plates, from what I understand, what I remember in my learning, was that they were not actually like an object.
Mm-hmm. I've heard different things. Yeah.
Right. This was, and the way that they would talk about them were specific kind of like code words that the York Rite people of that time would have understood as just normal language, kind of like us talking about malefic and benefic planets, and primary and secondary motion, and diurnal and nocturnal placements. Like you develop a language, and
their own jargon.
Yeah, and so this was kind of like, these kinds of things were in the zeitgeist at that time. And so later, and this kind of goes to our discussion about, and the last time we talked about the application of Venus to Algol, right, in the chart. And it goes to, I think it goes to talk about later about how the follow-on church utilized a lot of this information to then, perpetrate something that, using language that they didn't have access to understanding. Like if Joseph Smith talks about golden plates and seeing angels, and he means one thing, and you hear it and think of it another, and then he dies and you go on using your own understanding of what that means, it's going to be radically different. And I think that there's a real strong possibility that that Brigham Young capitalized on the language to control the population in Utah in certain ways.
Mhm.
So that's what I would say about the golden plates, and again, I'm not trying to apologize for them. I think that all of these 5 things, and we don't need to go through all 5 of them, but I think all of them are, if you look at the historical record and historians and apologists and people that are opposing it, there are arguments for and against all of them of why they could be fraud or not fraud, right? And so I think that is a good example of why, we can use the horary. So, yeah. Anyways, I don't need to go through all 5 unless you want me to, but
I think it gives a good example of what it is that we're talking about. Is it feels like there are ideas that are being presented as evidence, and yet, as you just described, they are not solid. They are not finite. We know for sure,
right?
Scientifically proven. Whatever. There are arguments for and against in all the ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I guess this is where the horary comes in.
Should we bring it up?
I think it's quite impressive that he's come up with 5 different reasons. Like, there's clearly a pattern that he's trying to convey here through multiple things. It's not just like, it's not just like, well, he had a vision, right? He had the vision, he's got the plates, and there's all these other things that show that indicate towards that. Also, when we're reading the Doctrine and Covenants, and there's stories about the plates being like the threat of the plates being discovered, and so they're going to move the plates from one place to another.
Right.
I'm like, all these stories about something that might not exist, but because it's a form of Freemasonry language, I'm like, I don't know. It's just a bit far-fetched for me. When the stories in the Doctrine and Covenants actually insinuate that there is like something to take, that mobsters and whatever want to get their hands.
And there's contradiction, right? Like the translation being this gift to be able to know ancient languages or to not know them, but through the voice of God, be able to speak it.
Right.
Or looking at the stone in the hat. So we're not even looking.
It's very clear he didn't actually translate the plates, right? It was clear
Right.
that he used the stone in the hat to get the Book of Mormon, and that's not historically disputed at all. It's in his own account, his own record.
Only that was never taught to me as a child. That's
really?
been recent. Yeah. Recently with the stone and the hat coming forward.
Oh,
That,
yeah, no,
so
I
to
learned
me,
that. I
he
learned
was
that in
speaking.
like deacon, like as a deacon, that was part of our lessons, was the stone in the hat technique. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Until recently.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it wasn't in my realm of knowledge.
But I had teachers that were still many of the teachers that I had were still teaching outside of the official handbook. So I do think that the official handbooks probably didn't have it, but and this is why correlation came in, because there were teachers that were teaching stuff that wasn't correlated. And now I think you would have a very hard time finding uncorrelated information in classes. Yeah.
Which is partly what makes this all so interesting, is that there really is a lot of contradiction. We just don't know.
Yeah. Right. Like, I mean, I remember, like, I just had a very different kind of upbringing. I remember, like, as a Boy Scout, and in our young men's activity, learning how to control and manage our chi, learning about chi and energy, meridians in our bodies, and, controlling our chi. Like, this was in the church, and, like in the cultural.
We were taught how to babysit and how to make recipe books and how to sew, because we were going to be mothers in Zion. That's what we got to learn.
Yeah. Okay, should we bring up the horary again and do some more
let's
talking about it? Okay, let me see if this works. Okay, I think it's on. Yeah, yes. I think it's on the recording, and this is the right one. Yes. Okay, so
so we would break it down. as you were saying, that first part of life, 0 to 13, maybe we'd push to 14-ish. I don't know where we would want to make that line.
For our listeners that are not so familiar, we're going to talk about, and you're on board with us, talking about the triplicity method. Yeah. So for those maybe more Mormon leaning people that aren't astrology centered, triplicity is referring to the it's another way of talking about the elements or the assignment of elements to the different zodiac signs, and then based upon the elemental, and that's fire, air, water, earth, are the 4 elements that we're dealing with. Based upon those elemental assignments, there is a traditional method of correlating a specific planet with the kind of like the governance of that triplicity or that element. So when we're dealing with Aries, is the one we're talking about here. Aries is a fire element, and so Aries is dealing with the fire element triplicity ruler. And to make it just more complicated, because astrologers love doing that, then we say, okay, well, actually, we want to orient this towards people who are charts that are more dominantly controlled by the sun, or charts that are more dominantly controlled by the moon, and we say diurnal for day or nocturnal for the moon. So then that say, okay, we need a different ruler, triplicity ruler, depending upon which luminary is strongest or present for what we're talking about. And then there's this third category, because obviously we need another category in astrology that's called the participating ruler, or the third ruler. And this is neither diurnal nor nocturnal, but is supposed to help the other 2 rulers in certain situations. So anyways, that's when we're talking about these triplicity rulers. We're talking about these 3 different planets that have been assigned systematically to the element of fire in a diurnal chart. And do either of you want to rattle off what those planets are?
Go ahead, Bianca. No. Okay.
So are we
Sun,
talking now about
it'll be Sun,
the triplicity
Jupiter,
lords,
and Saturn.
the triplicity rules of fire.
Fire.
Yeah, that's Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn.
Saturn is participating. Yeah.
So that is because the sun is the ruler. This is a diurnal chart, right? So we've got a daytime chart because the sun is above the horizon.
Well, those are the triplicity rulers. So Sun is the diurnal ruler, Jupiter is the nocturnal ruler, and Saturn is the participating ruler. So this is a diurnal chart. So if we were selecting one ruler, we would choose the sun. But when we're looking at the spread of all 3 and we're doing the allotment of the periods of life, we use all 3 for the different periods of life. And then
but because it's a day chart, we put the diurnal ruler as the first portion of the 3. So if we're dividing the life into 3 portions, the first would be the sun, because it's a daytime chart.
If it was a night chart, then the first would be Jupiter, exactly.
Yeah.
Saturn would always be the third. Saturn is the participating ruler for this one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then the second part of life will be assigning Jupiter
to Jupiter.
And are we going to do the third to Saturn being the end of life, or is that just
the last third of the life, or the last portion of life, however we want to call it out? Just kind of, I mean, he was 39 when he died, so it can be equally divided into 13 years each. But, it's not always exactly even. We're basically just saying the first period, second period, and third period. And maybe the first period's a little bit longer or a little bit shorter or whatever. But it's just, we're basically just trying to talk about the progression of the person's life at this point.
So the first third-ish we are giving to the sun in Aries.
There we go, right there.
Mm-hmm.
Let me take the vanishing off so we can keep these circled. There we go. Okay.
And domicile in the 9th house of higher learning. There's definitely that push to want to
Actually
be
exalted, right?
And here's Jupiter. That's the second one we'll do. And then I'll just highlight
Also
them.
exalted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first part of life, the sun exalted in the ninth house, can lead towards someone who was a truth seeker,
Mm-hmm.
possibly ninth house of higher learning.
Mm-hmm.
And but then I think with the sun exalted in Mars in the ninth house, I'm thinking of someone who has so much faith in themselves and their capabilities, like to a fault almost.
Mm-hmm.
Being unaware of maybe some of the ego, the self-inflation pitfalls.
Yeah.
Then the second part of life being Jupiter.
In horary language, we would say the sun exalts itself, right? So in this case, if we're using sun as the signifier for Joseph, then Joseph is exalting himself, has a very high opinion of himself, feels like they're in touch with their higher power, and feels, as he did, justified in going out into the garden to pray and get an answer, and like he should actually receive one, right? Like,
exactly.
Well, and as you stated, even though this is the first portion of life when he's young, that is when these things are starting to happen, right? Like when it first takes place.
Right.
So there is a sense of leadership. There's a sense of stepping into the role of a spiritual leader of some sort. So
there is
perfect. Right on.
And the sun is completely unencumbered by malefics in this place, right? It's exalted and it's unencumbered by malefics, and it's in the ninth house. So it feels like it's a very good and strong placement, dignified. It's got a lot of dignity. It is self-absorbed, which is, the egotistical idea that, oh yeah, I'm going to go out as a 13-year-old kid and just ask God to talk to me. Well,
and that with Jupiter exalted for the next portion, both of them exalted, it implies falling off the pedestal, right? Like there's the only way to go from there is down.
Yeah. So we want to bring the second portion of life in now. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Let me just get my arrow here. So now we're talking about Jupiter. Jupiter in Cancer is also exalted, and Jupiter at the 18th degree of Cancer is 3 degrees off of its actual exaltation degree. So very, very exalted at this point, very highly dignified Jupiter. And this time in the 11th house, right?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how we've got
society,
this
community member, audience, his congregation, right? Exalted in the congregation place.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the sun in the ninth house being in its joy, and then we've got Jupiter in the 11th in its joy.
Right.
So on the nose.
Yeah. Not just essential, but accidental dignity, both very strongly dignified planets. Both of them unencumbered by malefics.
Well, in Jupiter again, and we mentioned this in the last video, just that connection with Joseph Smith himself. So having that be that middle portion of his life where he would have been the actual kind of godlike figure that Jupiter is.
Yeah. And the moon has just separated from Jupiter. That's an interesting. So in the second, so that is, so let me just get those to go away. I can redraw them in a second. So yeah, so the chart is set with the moon being a new moon, right? So the moon is new, or forming the first opening crescent. And so the moon, when we're looking at the sun, the moon is also separating from the sun, a little bit longer separation, but with Jupiter, the moon is separating, is just barely separated from Jupiter, like, a degree, 1 degree separated, which is very tight for a moon.
Again, exalted.
Yeah.
Exalted moon, right? Ruling the Cancer.
Right.
It's like everything's working out really well here.
Like the soil is fertile in that new moon.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
With watery
Meaning
Cancer.
the environmental conditions were conducive to something where Joseph Smith's going to go out, pray in the grove, get his answers, and start forming something on that basis into a second phase of life, which is a Jupiter.
So let's stick with the first phase right now, Sun. Would you judge the Sun as a fraud in this place?
No.
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't either? I wouldn't either.
I think it's as you described, Ryan, like what a beautiful place. And Bianca, you said it as well, to have the confidence of youth, to have high levels of faith, to really believe that they can go out and pray and get an answer, and to have that kind of courage to start. I mean, it's beautiful, really.
Yeah.
I do think one thing to think about, though, is that, oops, where did it go? Where did it go? Oh, there we go. Right there. The Sun is essentially 9 arc minutes away from the Anaretic degree, or from the Anaretic degree, which it's close to changing signs. It's moving into the Anaretic degree, which is always a debilitating place for any planet. And so the Sun is exalted, but there is there is a signal of a change, about an imminent change in
dignity. And there's going to be a dignity change eventually.
Right.
Like very soon, like within 9 arc minutes.
So it does fall off of its exaltation point, but it doesn't go to a place of fall.
And it hasn't fallen yet. It's just signaling like, oh, something might be shifting.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's coming, right?
I mean, if you're going to go into, decans and bounds, then like we might find some other, often the malefic there at those end degrees, for sure.
Let's do it. Pulling out my nightlight dignity sheet. Right.
I mean, the last bound that is going to be Saturn.
The decan is Venus. Yeah. So it's in the being in the decan of Venus is a positive thing. Being in the term of Saturn is, and moving into the Anaretic degree is kind of, so we would say that the Sun needs to operate within the constraints or under the rules of Saturn at that point. And so even though the Sun is exalted, there is some constraint and limitation that the Sun, in this case representing Joseph, needs to operate in order to allow that dignity to be as full as it can be. Like they have to obey, the Sun has to obey Saturn in that spot, even though the Sun is exalted, and there's mutual reception. Sun is in there too. So Saturn is in Aries. There's reception there, but and
Venus, if we're looking to that change, the Sun is moving into Venus's domicile. So
yes.
I guess what I'm hearing is there's mixed signals here, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think the mixing, I read the mixing as a future event. I read the Sun is strong, but there is imminent change, and the imminent change is going to be a substantial reduction in dignity. And as that dignity is shifting, there is considerable restriction that is being placed upon the Sun. And I would say that, looking at the life of Joseph, I would say that restriction is the obvious environment in which he lived, which the religious revival that was taking place was, had limitation. People were skeptical. There was a lot of skeptics. There was a lot of limitations for 13-year-old being able to just come out and say this kind of stuff happened, so I would say he lived in a restrictive environment, despite the fact that he was himself essentially dignified from his own nature.
Well, to add additional, and we don't need to go down this rabbit hole, but certainly creating structures, like that's another thing that is coming.
Yeah.
Right, is developing something where there is a form of system, where there's a form, right?
Right.
It's bringing the visions into matter, which also Saturn can represent. So
Yes.
there can be multiple things happening at the same time.
Yes.
So do you still then, Ryan, Bianca, do you agree then that even with all of that being said, first stage of life was Joseph Smith a fraud?
I would say this, the chart reads no. I would say. I'd still say no. First stage no.
Mm-hmm.
With
Yeah,
imminent change.
I would say no. I mean, yeah, I don't think the way you were describing it around Saturn and its fallen state. I do think that speaks to more the restrictions, the limitations, and trying to have his exalted or inflated view of things kind of suppressed, made it harder for him to really
So let's think about that. So if it's true that he's not, if we say, okay, not fraud, let's tie that back to the example. So then he believed in his own vision.
And I would give that to a 14-year-old boy.
Totally, right?
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like we have to remember we're talking about a lived person, just a person, a little boy.
Yeah.
You know, remove from all of the stories and everybody getting all up in arms. Like, here's a little boy that said a prayer.
When I was 14,
yeah,
I had all kinds of crazy visions and dreams, and like I believed all of them.
Yeah.
I still do. Most of them.
But here's the thing as well, though. The question is Joseph Smith a fraud? And I know we're assessing each stage of life.
Yeah, right.
And we're coming to the verdict that the first stage of life, there probably wasn't a whole lot of fraud going on, and that he did believe in the righteousness and of his beliefs, whatever. But I think that changes over time.
I think it does. But I just, as the chart reads, the sun is the sun receiving in a condition of, or receiving the conditions of, that would signify fraud, regardless of who the person is. If we just said, oh, read this horary chart for, signs of fraud with the sun, how would you read it in this layout?
Yeah, I'm gonna still
say no
stick
fraud.
With no, I'm gonna say no.
But Bianca looks like she wants to say fraud.
I know. It's fraud. It's tough when it's connected with something that has been such a big part of our lives. But like you said, Ryan, this chart was no name. Like, does this look like fraud right here based on
sun? Yeah.
Not being connected to a person that we know their history or anything? Would we look at that and say, yeah, absolutely?
Yeah.
I don't think
I would say if this was a random person, we're saying we need to assess the dignity of the person based on the position of the sun, I would say they're probably well dignified and maybe a solid philosopher, solid astrologer, teacher, some kind of, I would say, yeah, they probably have a good moral compass with the sun in the ninth house and its joy. It's an exalted planet in its joy, would be like, yeah, it's probably got some, I wouldn't look at that as any sign of fraud based on the sun's condition in this chart. The closest thing, well, no, because I was going to try to bring in Uranus, but it's a in conjunct. So even Uranus we couldn't bring into that consideration. So even if we wanted to bring an outer planet, I mean, we could do anything we want to, but I think I think we'd be stretching it far to try to say that Uranus is giving the sun,
I mean, if we're doing anything we want, Chiron's sitting there. So
well, yeah, I mean, I think if we do look at Chiron, I think that's, the sun is separating from Chiron. So I think that's speaking to if I was to like interpret the Chiron in this, I would say this speaks to Joseph's own internal turmoil that he's going through, right? His own inner, why is he going out asking these questions? Because he's got some kind of inner stuff going on, right?
Right.
And I would say that's the Chiron connection.
Yeah.
but that's also totally not traditional.
Not traditional, right? So then if we move to Jupiter.
Let's move to Jupiter.
Yeah, move to the
second stage of life. So the first stage of life, we're kind of, even though Bianca wants him to be a fraud in the first stage, we're kind of like both.
You're jumping the gun.
We're all saying. So anyways, Jupiter in Cancer, 11th house. And like Bianca, you said, this is his joy and his exaltation. So we have another exalted, joyful planet, the second stage of life.
Yeah, I don't know. It just
really happy, really strong.
I'm always wary of an exalted Jupiter, and I'm like,
Well, as of late, we're all living it, and it's been a shit storm. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that, in this second phase of life is when Joseph really expanded his footprint of building congregation, building followers. These were all 11th house things that he was doing, right? And he actually was really successful at doing them.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like,
it seems like a very successful time. I was just looking. It looks like it would be in the bounds of Venus and the decan of Mercury. Like, okay.
Very mercurial, this Jupiter.
Yeah.
Building relationships, speaking, presenting.
Is it in the bounds of Venus?
Am I seeing that right?
No, I think it's the bounds of, let's see, 5, 10.
Mercury?
Yeah, I think it's Mercury, 10, 11, 12, 13. And he's 18, 13. So 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 is Mercury still.
Yeah, because I have a 16 degrees Cancer moon, and that is in the bounds of Mercury.
Bounds of Mercury. Bounds of Mercury, term of Mercury. Yep.
Yeah. Interesting, hey?
I might have a different
Very
interesting.
Mercury is rudderless and
It's
peregrine.
interesting that the exaltation degree of Jupiter is in the bounds in terms of Mercury.
And so
they're both decan and bound.
And if we think of what they say about a peregrine Mercury, which I'm not where they put it in this peregrine, the classical signature. Hold on, sorry. Mercury peregrine is morally rudderless. That's so
the ruler, the bound and decan ruler of, oops, I'm drawing that in the wrong spot. The bound and decan ruler of Jupiter is in a condition of being morally rudderless, but it does not saying that Jupiter is morally rudderless, just his ruler.
But it's under the guise of a morally rudderless
ruler. So Mercury is telling Jupiter, you should be morally rudderless. You should do some sneaky things, right? Like Mercury is trying to like say this to Jupiter. Meanwhile, Jupiter's like,
Jupiter is exalted, and there's this expansion and growth and this drive for that.
Yeah.
You lose touch of where I guess you get put in positions of making decisions that might work in favor of your personal gain, but at the detriment of others. And there's that morally rudderless.
Yeah, I mean, exaltation can have that, inflated ego capacity for sure.
Yeah.
And, and again, I think that obviously somebody who is growing his congregation at the pace that he was is going to have an inflated ego and is probably going to get more and more inflated as time goes on.
Right. As it's
the more success that he gets, the bigger that Jupiterian head pop is going to be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
My initial, when we very first started this, and I just straight up went, oh my gosh, exalted Jupiter in Cancer in the 11th house just looks like a cult leader. Like, bam, there was nothing else. Totally. There was no technical. I was just feeling it.
Right.
That was the initial thought.
Yeah.
Is that what we would read? I mean, going back to how we just did that with the sun, would we look at this, disconnected from Joseph Smith and just say,
yeah, well, we have this modern view of what cults happen. We know in the time that we're living in now, we've lived through Charles Manson and Jim Jones and whoever, right? And so we have this radically different view of what a cult leader is. But back in the early 1800s, the 19th century, there were a lot of people that were trying to be cult. There were a lot of cults starting, and this was like, it was in the zeitgeist to be a cult leader. So it was quite desirable to be a cult leader. So he was doing something that was desirable, and he was doing it good. And, being a cult leader wasn't necessarily viewed as being a bad thing, because, you didn't have Jonestown. You didn't have an example of people just, of the cult leader going and telling people to take a bunch of poison, and killing themselves. So the cult leader, the idea of cult in modern times, I think, has evolved. And when we say the word cult as modern people, it has a pretty negative idea, a bit negative flavor. But I just don't think that people in the early 19th century would have had that same level of distaste for the word cult.
Yeah, I have the image in my mind from ages back, because I feel so old now, but of the videos that we were shown in church. I don't know if you recall, like the little tent gatherings of the different churches, and Joseph Smith running, like, oh, do I go to this one? Do I go to that one? Do I go to that one? And then, it shows him praying and being told that none of them are the right church, none of them are true. And so that image in my mind, as you're saying, Ryan, it's not some creepy underground, bloodshed stuff. There was just this tent and that tent and that tent. Everybody was sharing what they were understanding at the time.
And I will say, I don't know if I've said it on recording before. I know I've said it to you guys, but I will say that, for people listening, that from my perspective, as part of my story, like that statement from that knowledge that Joseph gained about no church is true and not to join any of them. I always, from a very young age, from as long as I can remember, felt that applied to the very church itself. Like I never thought it was never like, oh yeah, join none of them and then let's go make the right one. It was like, join none of them. And yeah, just like the fact that we're on earth and doing these things is kind of like, we just have to deal with the fact that we're all imperfect. And it was like, because it was always like, I always felt like I was taught, like, as an individual person, your own connection to the divine is the most important thing. And it's even more important than any, authority figure, bishop or anything. I always felt like that. And I just remember I was listening to another one of John's podcasts. I haven't, I hadn't listened to him for a while, but I was just listening to one, and recently, and he was talking about, bishops and things like, and I just remember, like, I never, like, it was the recent one about the guy who was just leaving BYU and going to surrender his records or something. I forgot his name, but it was one of the most recent ones. But like, he had to deal with a bishop and a stake president that were opposed to his masturbation practices as a young man, and were telling him that masturbation was, second only to murder and this kind of stuff. And so they had to go to the bishop to clear these kinds of things, right? And like, I didn't have that. I wasn't under that same condition, but I just remember things that other people might have thought they had to go to the bishop for. I deliberately had the idea that no, you shouldn't do that, because that followed the pattern of Catholic priests, where you had to go confess to your Catholic priest to get absolution. And I had always been taught that we don't do that in Mormonism. We don't do Catholic absolution as priests, and you need to find it for yourself. And only if you can't pray and find your own answer to this or your own forgiveness and all this, then you might bring it up to somebody. But it wasn't like, like this whole idea of bishops and like giving penance and not taking the sacrament. And I know they do it, right?
Absolutely.
But like, I was always very much like, that's wrong. Like that behavior.
Ryan, I don't think you understand how incredible that is, that you could grow up within the Mormon faith and hold those beliefs. I know I am not speaking for just myself. That is not how I felt, how my family, my siblings, my
I
friends felt.
know.
It was any little discretion was, you go to the
I
bishop.
didn't understand people felt like that until I was like in my 20s.
Yeah, that's crazy. Crazy.
Yeah.
Well, and even your understanding of, as we get back into the chart,
Yeah.
I never would have thought that our church, the only true church on the earth,
Yeah.
would be considered among those that God said don't join.
Mm.
My full understanding was those are not accurate. Hang tight. I'll give the right stuff to you.
Mm.
And now that you have the right stuff,
Yeah.
go preach it. Go
Yeah.
be Jupiter and Cancer in the 11th house and gather my sheep, gather the little chicks,
Right.
be that big, beautiful Jupiter and Cancer mother hen and bring everybody together in truth.
Yep.
That was absolutely my understanding. And my own trusting myself, hogwash. No, doubt your doubts.
Mm.
Like, you can ask questions to authority people, but only if there are questions within the realm that they say is okay to ask. Otherwise, just shush those questions, but it was always to an external authority.
I think that, growing up, a big part of the reason why I had the feeling I did is reading my own family history. And like one of my ancestors, Sarah Sturdivant Levitt, she was the mother of Dudley Levitt, who was one of the largest, Levitt families, one of the largest polygamous families. So this is certainly, this is not a unique ancestor. Like there are many tens of thousands of us out there, but I don't know if everybody has access to her journal. And she wrote a journal. And I just remember, people were like inspired about Joseph, but it was like, the reason why they were inspired about the movement is because it was a self-empowering movement, as opposed to the Methodists and the Baptists and the different places where it was much more intercessionary still. And the whole reason why people were excited about the movement in general was because of the self-empowerment, and not.
I love that idea. I wish I understood that growing up.
Yeah.
I
Anyway,
think we moved away from it over time, for sure, as the generations.
Yeah.
As the church developed, I think it moved away from that, for sure.
Yeah.
As it became more institutionalized, right?
Right. It has.
Yeah. Correlation, like we said.
Venus applying to Al Gore.
Yeah, there you go. But again, if we isolate and we look, second portion of Joseph Smith's life,
second portion,
these pieces all together.
What do we say? Do we have a verdict?
Well, when I think of Jupiter as well, I mean, I think of Zeus and multiple wives, and
Totally
one of those things.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
Yeah, and I know it may have been a thing back in those days, and then society moved away from it. But I do think like there were some things that I felt like he may have felt entitled to, super Jupiterian, and that was like multiple wives. But then it's like, why keep that like secret or like, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know fully how this went, but I do know that some of these women were still so young, like 14 years old.
They were, and I'm not going to try to like address the youth, other than the fact that people did get married and have kids way younger back then in general. But what I will say is that I can understand. So, as you both know, I'm polyamorous. I'm non-monogamous. I'm queer. Like, I understand being in a position that you can't talk about what's really going on for you. And so I don't know whether Joseph was authentically polyamorous or whether he was just a cheat. I have a very lenient view of people who have sex outside marriage, because I don't have, like, it's totally, I'm totally fine with it. Right. So, but I do understand, like, if you're having different, like, the sex is so taboo that, if you have same-sex attraction, if you have different gender identity, if you are even, I know a lot of non-monogamous people who cannot be openly non-monogamous because of still today societal ostracization that takes place. And so I do understand, Joseph being a polygamy denier of his own polygamy. And it could be that that is a sign of fraud. But again, I also think that might not be. Like, it could just be like he was in the closet, like just being somebody that who's in the closet. I wouldn't say that they're a fraud just because they're in the closet. So I don't know, but I think it's possible that he was, authentically this way. He could have been a poly, and it was in the zeitgeist. The Cochranite, conversion was a big reason why polyamory or not polygamy came into the Mormon Church, and the Oneida community, which started just after Joseph died, was a free love community. So it was in the zeitgeist, and it was also not mainstream, right? So it's kind of like it's in the zeitgeist, but maybe you need to still be in the closet about it a little bit. So I have a little bit more lenience towards that. Also, thing that's forgotten a lot is that there were, and there's all, we look back on it as a modern society, and we try to place the polyandry that was taking place as something that was, forced upon the women. But there are a lot of examples of polyandry throughout history.
What is polyandry?
Women who have more than one male partner.
Oh, right.
Because so there were women that were married to multiple men and having sex with multiple men. And, maybe that was because the men were complete schmucks and forcing it on the women. But I mean, women like to have sex too. It's having sex being desirable is not just a male thing, like women have been polyandrous, like in Tibet, polyandry is a common thing among women. It's common for women to have multiple husbands. It's not abnormal at all. So I just think within the realm of human experience, trying to vilify the polyandry and make the women victims, maybe they were and maybe they weren't. I don't know. It's hard to go back and say. But I do think that, women like sex as much as men when it's good.
Well, and within the teachings, as far as we understand, which is, I believe, is actually quite minimal. I don't think that we understand what the actual teachings were at the time.
Yeah.
So that's always in question. But I think, again, based on what I learned, it was more that men were saying, I want you to be sealed to Joseph so that you're within the eternal family. So now they've got two husbands. Right. So polyandry is
exactly. This is one of the narratives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the narrative of it was all the men's thing and the women didn't have anything to do with it.
Right.
Which could be the case. But I think it's not fully fair. I just know how independent and fiercely independent the women of that age were and still are. Like the women's movements didn't come from, feminism didn't come out of, like, it just pop up out of nowhere. Like there was a long, hundreds of years hard work by women across the world that moved this. And I just think, it could have been the men were entirely forcing it on the women. And, maybe they weren't, like maybe the women were excited to be married to Joseph.
I like bringing this view, Ryan. It does kind of mess with my head a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I just finished watching the what's it called? Follow the Prophet, something like that.
Yeah.
That's the spin-off from Warren Jeffs. So there's the other Samuel Bateman who brainwashed these women. Here he is doing really truly horrific things, and they are strong women.
Yeah.
They go through so much and they put up with so much, and it is horrible. And they're saying, we need you for our salvation. We need you to, come and guide us. We can't make decisions without you, So at what point did that strength of the women get used against them, and
well, and it's important to remember how strong Emma was, right? She was running her own parallel Masonic sect of the Relief Society. She right. And these were not like, I'm subservient to Joseph. She was her own leader. And when Joseph died, she took a huge section of the following with her. She was a strong woman, and women that followed her were strong women. Like, this was like, these were women that were like, we are the shit, we're doing. And so it's like, I think it's a little bit of a disservice to take what happened to women in the United States in the 50s and 60s and the complete, that's when the Relief Society became subservient to the priesthood. Up until that point in time, the Relief Society was a completely separate organization with their own money, their own access to resources, their own leadership. They voted on things themselves, right? So there was a period in American history that really shut women down in the Mormon church. And I don't think we can like take that, what happened there, and stick it back on the early 1800s and say that's what was going on there. Cause I just think they're kind of different. I think what was going on in the 19th century with women is what led to women getting the vote and, equal rights. And I think all this stuff just moved into it. And there was this weird Mormon thing that happened where they're like gonna like decommission the Relief Society and put it under the priesthood. And that was kind of like in Mormon history, that's kind of like a weird thing that happened.
Which could be its own interesting timeline to find out when that happened and see what was going on.
Yeah.
Astrologically, that would be really interesting to see what shift was happening.
You just picked a chart that you're going to do some.
Well, right now, how about we figure out Jupiter and Cancer?
Joseph Smith. So back to Joseph Smith. Second period of life. Fraud or no fraud? Fraud. Okay. Where do you see the fraud?
The bounds in terms of Mercury and an inflated Jupiter, exalted in Cancer. Okay. I think that's just
So separate from any story, if you were to see that isolated, that's what you would lean into.
Yeah, I don't trust an exalted Jupiter.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Kind of like it. I like your reasoning.
I'm going to say not fraud, because I think just looking at the classical signifiers, I don't see like Mercury. I do kind of see what you're saying with Mercury. Like Mercury is debilitated as the term and decan ruler of Jupiter. But, Jupiter being exalted doesn't, to me, signal fraud. It signals excess, overreaching, and for me, when I look at the narrative of the cycle, I think that this overreaching and excess that we're seeing with Jupiter and the Mercury story is not so much about fraud in this period, but talking about what's coming in our next period. I don't know. Mindy, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know that I could be a tiebreaker, because I really love Bianca's breakdown and that having that Mercury piece. This would be a hard one for me to give a conclusion, because I really do struggle. I can see it. I can see the 11th house. I can see that exaltation, the ego gathering the troops, creating a really big group of people following this leader role. But I can't say that automatically would mean fraud. I
second period of life, we're tied.
Yeah. Yep. It's a tie.
Mindy's not going to break the tie for us.
No, I'm not. I think I would probably lean to no, because just by itself, I can't say that equals fraud.
You can lean to yes.
No. I know. I'm not like picking teams. I'm looking at it going, gosh, I just don't know that if I looked at Jupiter and Cancer by itself. Like I said, I felt it as a big group leader. I got that. But I wouldn't automatically look at it and go, well, that is a liar. That is
I do see Bianca's point about Mercury being in a debilitated condition.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think that's a totally valid thing.
Yeah.
I just look at it as the start, it's the planting of the seed of what is to come, is how I would read that.
But I also think that, like, even in Bonatti's dividing the life up into, I think when we use Bonatti's way of separating, dividing the life into the first part, second part, possibly third part, I think his way of using the triplicity rulers to indicate phases of life, the way it's going, beginning, middle, end, I think it's more just beginning and end. Like, I don't think he uses the participating, which would be what, Saturn in this situation. I don't think he uses the third triplicity ruler. He mainly divides the life up into the first half and second half. So for us to do a third would be kind of stepping away from my understanding of Bonatti's triplicity rulership delineation as far as it's concerned. So to say we're going to use a third phase and that's the end, given his life was so short anyway, is going to be like, well, like, I don't know. I think there's not a whole lot of life to divide up into thirds, but there's enough to divide into twos. First half, second half. The participating, or the cooperating ruler, the third ruler, Saturn, as informing those two stages of life. So I think Saturn being the participating with the sun in the first half of life. I liked how, Ryan, you mentioned that Saturn was more describing the restrictions of the time, him being only 13, 14 years old around the first vision, and just not really having the credibility to be able to bring about his agenda. And then, so that's Saturn's purpose, in my opinion, his role in the first part. And then the second half of life would be, it switches, or I would say the second half of life, he develops into, now we've got Saturn informing an exalted Jupiter in the 11th house, and how does that look? And given that Jupiter in the 11th exalted is in the bound and the decan of Mercury, who is peregrine, so morally rudderless, that on top of a participating ruler, Saturn, who is fallen, can indicate to me fraudulent behavior, because I don't trust in a morally rudderless, informed, exalted Jupiter as far as I could throw him. And so for me, I'm thinking, I don't know if it indicates to me the possibility more strongly towards, yes, there could be fraudulent behavior, because there is some self-interest at the end of this. And although an exalted sun, there is self-interest in the 9th house, but I think a Jupiter in the 11th seems like some scheming and some like, what can I get from this? Because the 11th house is benefactors and alliances. In going back to the natal, what we understand the 11th house to be is that it is benefactors from, that's going to help you eventuate into that 10th house of notoriety, reputation.
It's the Agatha Daimon, right?
Yeah.
The good spirit. The good daimon.
So that was my take, and how I'm like, I'd rather divide the life up into a half, like first half, second half, and then use the participating Saturn ruler of the fire sign day chart fire signs to just kind of inform the two different phases of life.
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that there's kind of two basic camps. One is the use of the application of 2,
Mm.
and the other is the application of 3. And within the application of 2, there's also 2 camps, and that is more traditional, and one is Ptolemaic, because Ptolemy uses only 2 triplicity rulers. He doesn't use a participating ruler, if I remember right. Or they're ordered differently. So there's something about Ptolemy's triplicity ruler, which I don't want to speak out of hand, but there's something different about it. But my understanding is that the application of 2 is valid, and it comes from the deeper origins, the more historical application, and that it's through Abu Mashar and Al-Andarzaghar and Al-Qabisi in the medieval time, in the Arabic astrologers, where the application of the division into 3 starts coming into play. And I think you're right in saying that when we do the division of 2, we use the 3rd ruler, which would be Saturn, as the participating ruler, as the influencer on both of those. And so I think that your point is valid in saying, Saturn in a fallen state, applying to both the Sun and Jupiter, could bring in this flavor of fraudulence into the discussion. So I think it's totally a valid way of looking at it.
Brian,
yeah.
Just quickly, you used the word flavor, and I wanted to ask your thought. Are we talking about just spicing it up, or are we talking about calling the shots, right? Like if it's a cooperating participant, not the boss.
Yeah.
Right. So they're not reporting. Jupiter and the Sun as triplicity rulers are not reporting to Saturn.
No.
It's only flavoring it.
It's flavoring. Yeah. The participating ruler comes in to help support, that's what I understand it anyways. So, I do think that, we with Jupiter and the Sun, they are both exalted, and they are in good houses. So their accidental and their essential dignity are both positively impacted. Neither one of them have witnessing or any kind of aspects from malefic planets. Well, I guess Saturn and Mars do witness Jupiter, so there is a witnessing taking place, but it's not a part. There's no kind of like within orb kind of aspect. And Mars is applying to Jupiter, but it has to go through Saturn to get there, and Jupiter is separating from Saturn. And applying to Venus. So Jupiter, in this case, Jupiter is separating from Saturn and applying to Venus, which is separating from a malefic and applying to a benefic. So that's also a bonifying condition. So Jupiter, I see that, with the Saturn and the participating and the fallen state of Saturn, we could be bringing in these themes. I do think that the Sun the earlier part of life is much stronger than the second, with Mercury also being peregrine. You got 2 influencing planets that have influence over Jupiter. But still, I still think that in general, my view is, and I know this is why we're divided. The second period of life, I think we have a division. We're tied on whether it's fraudulent or not fraudulent. I would still say there's not a strong enough indication of fraud in my case to rule definitively fraud.
Ryan, your sound is going out a little bit.
Let me replug. Hold on a second.
That sounds.
It sounded better.
Is that better?
I don't know if it's moving in and out a little bit, but
is it any better now?
That's better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let me know, and I can try to readjust it again.
I want to just kind of play a little bit of devil's advocate. If I were to be looking at this as a true blue believer, what happens? All of a sudden, the brain goes, oh, we've got this really lovely Sun in Aries in the 9th house, this beautiful leadership, God figure, truth-seeking, it's quite a lovely shining place. And then we've got Jupiter in Cancer again. We're going to gather the group of people who are helping to grow this fertile, faithful Jupiter faith, philosophy, religion. It's like, just by, as you've said, the dignities all look really nice. And so as a believer, I would potentially say, well, that Saturn in Aries, if that's going to flavor these, oh my gosh, we have a martyr on our hands. We have
Absolutely.
someone who has, is going to be murdered. There's the,
Absolutely.
the whole world is against him, and that proves how right he is.
And if the question was about martyrdom or death, we would see the clear sign.
Yeah.
The question
Yeah.
was about fraud, so we have to take the signifiers around what's being given to us too.
How about looking at the chart in a way where I know this has been mentioned in Adam's horary classes, but I can't quite remember specifically around where we see ourselves as the astrologer or as the oracle being asked these things from a querent.
Mhm.
Would we put ourselves as the astrologers in the 7th house? Or is that something that I'm
I
conflating?
kind
or
of think of
mixing up
us
with
as
something else?
co-querents in a way, because we're part of the
Interest?
congregation.
Influence
We're
on us?
part of the people
Yeah.
that were impacted by.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
We've
Yeah.
taken the
I kind of
question
think of
on
it
as our own.
Yeah, I
Right.
kind of think of it as I think of John Dehlin as a surrogate for all people who would ask this question. So it is John
Standing as
Dehlin as the
proxy.
querent, but we're part of that querent pool of people as well, I
Mm.
think. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
That's
Yeah.
how I would view it.
Mm.
Yeah, if he were asking us and we were then just the astrologer that was responding, then he becomes the querent, and
Mm.
we
Yeah, I
aren't
mean, I
even
think he is, but I
really
think of it as like a pooled querency,
yeah.
if there's such
Yeah.
a word.
Pooled querency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so Ryan, Bianca, is suggesting that we throw out the 3 as 3 parts of life. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, I think with starting with like Abu Mashar, I think that's where we start seeing the 3 come into play. And I think a lot more modern astrologers use the 3. It is true that the more Hellenistic, deeper roots of it is 2. But even with the 2, you're using Saturn to influence. I think I could see it going both ways. And I also see that this is the root of why the we have a tie on the second period of life.
Mhm.
Like I think we all came out okay. Yeah, like for me, the sun is like clearly strong in the 9th house, clearly exalted, no malefic influence. There is a shift happening, but it hasn't happened yet. It's still solid. There's a lot of integrity in the 9th house placement. The moon is exalted. I think it's so it's just like the first part is like, yeah, there's a lot of like um self contained innocence, it just speaks to his earlier part of life as a younger person, right? Then the second part I see, yeah, he's taken that, moved on into the Jupiterian expansion. And yes, whenever you expand, you're going to start getting muddy waters. And we see that muddy water influence with Saturn and Mercury. I just don't like like let's take Joseph Smith out of this. And if somebody came to me as a client and said, is my lawyer a fraud? And I was looking at the Jupiter was the signifier with these conditions, I wouldn't be able to say that the lawyer's a fraud. I wouldn't be able to come up with that. Like that's
Bianca wants to say,
infinite.
yes, he is.
Was that?
I can just see Bianca's face is like, yeah, he is.
I know that's why I'm saying that we have a tie on this one, right? So and I think it's okay to have a tie. We don't have to, it's fun to have a tie.
Yeah.
We don't have to agree.
I can see the difficulty in horary, like in the practice itself.
Yeah.
And why, our teacher is saying like he's been practicing for how long, and it's only here in his 15th year that he's like, okay, I think I'm confident enough to do this.
Yeah.
That's pretty telling. This is a tough one.
This is a tough one. And I can I totally see all of the points around it. But I just like if I had going back to this thing, if I had a client saying, is my lawyer a fraud, I would come back and say, I would probably say something, looks like your lawyer's got a robust business and a lot of, big client practice and may not have the ability to, be as, precise with their, work with you as you might otherwise be looking at. But, it doesn't look like they're going to be deliberately trying to steal your money or something. I would, something that would be like kind of how I would read this as a question if somebody came and said, is my lawyer or my accountant or, something like that, a fraud.
Yeah, that's tough because I could see in separating that out as a new question.
Yeah.
That's helpful. I could see looking at it and going, it's probably pretty egotistical.
Yeah.
Like watch it. This one's got an ego. And this one is growing his, like, there's an expansion, probably has a big practice, but also is growing their practice and is, looking for padding his wallet and stuff. So I can see that.
Trying to find ways to optimize his stuff, so yeah.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say this. I wouldn't say, oh, this is the sign of Bernie Madoff. At this Jupiter, I'd not say, oh, this is the Bernie Madoff signature. I wouldn't say that yet.
Mm-hmm. If we were to go, I was going to say, if we were to go to the third part, if we just kind of stayed on that path and said, final portion of his life, even if it was not cutting his whole life into thirds, maybe it's just how does it wrap up?
How does it wrap up? Yeah.
Saturn and Aries.
So let's look at that. So then let me just get my little mouse thing going here. There we go. So now we're looking at Saturn in Aries. And in this case, we clearly do not, because we're using Saturn, we are having a direct application from a malefic planet. That keeps disappearing. Let me get it back. So there we are. Yeah. So that is the third portion of life. Saturn is in its fall in the 8th house.
Being applied to by Mars. The end.
That's not a good, that's a rough signature.
Yeah.
It's not happiness. That's
in the first decan, of course, of Mars.
Yep. Yeah. What are the terms on that?
Terms. 8th degree. 8. So that puts it in Venus. Am I reading that right? I swear I'm getting my numbers wrong.
Is Venus. Yep.
Yes.
Yep. The first degree of Venus's term.
Which is kind of interesting. Maybe this is a stretch, but you like to make Brigham Young be Venus. So.
Well, it's not just Brigham Young, but just thinking about the fall, because we'll get that in a second, right? The following on of whether it's Brigham Young as an individual or the collective church, as the follow on after Joseph's death, the imminent connection of Mars with Saturn in the house of death. I think that there was a very clear shift culturally and theologically that took place when Brigham Young took over the Utah church. Which, and I don't think you see that same level of whatever you call it with the other breakoffs. I don't think it's always the same.
Oh, right.
Like Sidney Rigdon and Emma's stuff, but the one that was successful had these conditions, which are not so great, but the other ones were also not that successful. So it was kind of like the one who succeeded kind of did so under the auspices of some, negative stuff, which, I mean, it's just clear. Like Brigham Young was kind of out there.
What's coming next?
He ordered the murder of people all over the place, not just Mountain Meadows, but he had his own private assassin. Even Joseph, had an assassin. What was his name? What was Joseph's assassin? Brigham Young used him for a while too. What was his name? Remember his assassin's name?
No.
He had an on-staff assassin. Threatened assassination to the governor, like all this kind of stuff. It was like crazy times. This is the
So,
end of Joseph's life. This is what we're talking about. Like,
yeah.
you know, like Mars applying to Saturn at the end. What was his name?
It'll come as we keep talking.
Yeah. Anyways.
So the question directly placed on this third part then, Bianca, you got your
Yeah.
arguments. Have you got a different one?
No,
do you oppose this one?
No, yeah, I agree. He's a fraud. I think I just got to it quicker than using the 3 stages of life and using the third as like confirmation. I was like, I just got to it earlier with the Jupiter stuff. So yeah. But I can see how it would be, and I agree it would be in the second phase with Saturn fallen, Malefic applying to it.
I think if he was a fraud in the second stage of his life, he would have been discovered and found out way sooner.
Versus the third part? Is that what you're saying, Ryan?
And so we're talking from 13 to 26, right? I think from his age 13 to 26 was probably a lot less oriented towards fraud than from 26 to 39.
You know, I never figured it out this way to do it, but I do know that there is I think Bonatti goes through a specific way in how to divide the life up. I mean, it's
there's a calculation.
Yeah.
But that's, I think that would be more when we go into his birth chart. When we're looking at his birth chart, we would break that, because then we could break it up by using zodiacal releasing, Fidaria. You know, there's lots of ways we can break up the life, you know, and look at it historically at that point. Yeah. But
we clearly did not make it to his birth chart today.
Yeah.
Not yet. I mean, we still can if you want to keep going.
I think we call it.
Yeah. So yeah. I think so. I think this has been, so I think this is good. I liked doing this analysis in the 3 stages. I think it was kind of a fun way of like going back and looking at it. And I still do think like what we talked about last time is still relevant, because it is the things we talked about last time that lead through the evolution of his life to get him to the end state of, you know, Malefic applying to Mars, applying to Saturn in this fallen condition. So I think they both
seems to just kind of affirm what we came to, you know, I mean, using the outer planets last time, using some divination there, we came to a similar conclusion where, yes, we did end by saying, we're going to decide right now that no, there was not like intentional fraud out the gate, but we did say it changed. Yeah. So the narrative is essentially the same.
It's essentially the same. And I think we talked about it. I'd have to go back and listen to it, but I think we talked about it as the translation of light from Mercury, the Neptunian influence was, this could be truly visionary or it could be totally delusional. And if it's delusional, then it's more aligned with fraud. If it's truly visionary, then it's not. Which one is it, right? And if you're a true believer, it's going to be on the visionary side. If you're a skeptic, it's going to be on the delusion side. So I think our last reading was much more, you know, the scales are balancing, and you know, people still have to make up their mind. And I think this is more like, yeah, we can see the evolution of the life of a person that had some success, some devotion, you know, some authentic experiences that then culminated in some pretty catastrophic things. You know, I mean, like he was, you know, the bank scandal did happen. He was, you know, they did have assassins. What was his name? You know, these were things. I mean, they were like going and like doing bad stuff by the end, you know, by the end stuff was going on that, you know, probably shouldn't have. Or, I mean, if you're so believing on one side, you can justify it.
Absolutely.
But without that belief, there's no way you can justify some of the stuff that happened by the end, you know?
Agreed.
Yeah. But
Bianca, do you have any final thoughts? I feel like you are turning in there a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. This chart could go either way, depending on whether you're a believer or not a believer. And yeah, I think it's kind of fun to play with both sides and see, the different delineations or different possibilities. So yeah, I think that's my thoughts. Is that I think we've done a really good job at painting to like different possibilities to play with. So yeah, it's been good.
And I don't think either this time or last time did any of us come to the conclusion that he was just a rosy saint that, died, a martyr that didn't have any cause for his. I mean, he was shot in prison because he was, like there's a reason why he was there.
Yeah.
And I think we're all kind of really acknowledging that there was, regardless of how you get to it, by the time he dies, there's some pretty rough, stuff going on. And we know that historically, and we also can see it from the chart. Like the chart has done a good job, I think, of describing the history.
It is a little tricky coming from the mindset, as you've stated, if a believer, you could look at that rudderless Mercury and say, okay, was the vision a good thing? Were we leading to something truly beautiful and spiritual? Did it bring the message of a true vision? And Joseph was killed as a martyr, and that grows your faith, right? So again, based on the perception that you bring to it, which glasses are you going to put on? So the three of us happen to come saying, we feel that we've come to the conclusion in our lives, in our study, in our understanding that the way it ended was certainly not the way it began, right? Like he was not a 2-year-old walking around with fraud.
Right. Obviously. Right. And I think in fairness, I do think that the Jupiter, our tie on Jupiter is, I think we might see, if we were to look at other astrologers, we might get a similar splitting the room. But I think that on this final stage, the Saturn Mars, I think there would be no astrologer that would look at that and see that as like a positive.
Come up with anything good there.
Yeah, I mean, that's not the sign. When the question was the person a fraud? That's not the sign of, oh, they were a saint.
Yeah.
Which
that's a great wrap.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that. So let's wrap it. Let's wrap it there.
Let's wrap it there.
We've always got more, so keep coming back. So yeah, if you've got questions, comments, please add that. We would love to continue the conversation. We have lots and lots to say if you haven't figured that out yet. So join the conversation, and we'll see you next time.